Hello class, I got an email asking if I could explain how the vanishing point filter works in Photoshop. You may notice that I skipped over this earlier when we were doing things like filters. The reason is that the vanishing point filter does not actually work on smart objects, which means that any edit you do is destructive and not necessarily easily repeated. That said, it's still a very, very powerful tool. Let me go ahead and open up our old smart billboard. It's essentially just this billboard from the Pixabay free image library online. And then I, of course, just did a content-aware fill. You can see this back on week 3's videos, I believe. And so we have essentially two copies of this, one with no background and or with the background, the text edited away, and one with the text still in there. Now, the vanishing point filter can work on a new layer, so that's what I'm going to recommend. It's the least destructive way of handling it. Let's go ahead and make a new layer. And so we have a new layer. Again, it won't work on a smart layer, so bummer. And there's one more caveat to this, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But first, let's go ahead and just get right into it and see what it can do. I'm going to go over to filter, and you'll see that you have vanishing point, and they gave this the Alt-Control-V shortcut. I'm just going to pop right in here. Now, this is what would be called a modal in programming. It's essentially a new window dependent on the previous window. Think of it this way. We're in a mini program inside of Photoshop, and this mini program's a little big. Let me shrink it down a smidge. All right, so before you can do anything inside of the vanishing point filter, you have to go to the Create Plane tool up here in the top left corner. And you have some angle options, and you have some grid size options. You also have the ability to render your grid to Photoshop. I find this to be useful if you need to do transformation or replace and you want to do it in perspective later. Then you can create your grid right here and then use that grid. We'll get to that in a minute. So first things first, you need to create your plane. So think back to your perspective from your basic drawing class. You should have covered this on your way to your computer graphics degree. If you haven't had that yet, though, feel free to shoot me a quick message. I'll happily make a video covering how perspective works. It's often made more complicated than it really is. It's essentially just the idea that things get smaller as they go into the distance. And it gets a little more complicated when you realize that you can have more than one distance. In this case, for example, if you're looking up at a building that's like pointing straight up and down, you have back and forth, close to you and far away. And so things will be getting smaller that way, but you also have up and down at that point because you're looking up into the sky. And so you end up with like this 3-point perspective stuff that gets complicated, but usually we have what's called 2-point perspective. So in this case, this is a 2-point perspective plane that we're going to create. And so that's a lot of words. What does this mean? Just click a few times. While you have the create plane, it will try to draw a square. And I like to usually do the vertical and then horizontal, usually because vertical is easier. And all I'm going to do is follow along the edge of the billboard. And let's say I miss. Oh no, not a big deal. You have this tool, which is the Edit Plane tool. It will allow me to shrink it down. Now notice how the grid changed. And if I shrink it down further, how it's essentially drawing a grid for us. It's dividing this by what, 20? Let's see, 5, 10, 15, well, 19 of them. So imagine drawing 19 lines and cutting this plane up into 19 little equal distant chunks, and this one into 19 equal distance chunks, then taking a ruler and connecting those 2 points. That's how you get that. And then you do the same deal here along this line. You draw, what, like 80 of these or whatever little squares equal distance apart. Well, not really. It's not equal distance apart. The spacing gets smaller as it goes on. There's a trick to drawing that. Again, if you're curious, shoot me an email. I'll explain how all that works. Then you line it up here and you draw the ruler, voila. So Photoshop's doing all of that for you, including some really cool perspective tricks, so you don't have to worry about it. So again, let's say you really messed up and you don't want to have this. If you've like super goofed and it's giving you like different kinds of warnings, it turns yellow. It's like, are you sure you really want to be doing this? You can get it even worse and it will turn red. It's like, I don't even know how to draw this. What's going on? It's having all kinds of problems, right? You just want to start over. It'd be easier than trying to grab all the points and move over. You hit the delete key and nothing happens. The secret is you have to use backspace. All right. And that's true for while you're drawing points as well. If you end up with a point that's like weird, well, that used to be the case. Let's see if that's still the case. Yes, you can go hit backspace. That will allow you to remove your last point in case you missed. So backspace, not delete. So you get your create plane. You draw your plane. Careful. Again, I can move it if I miss. And voila. So now that I've got this, there are a bunch of things I could do. If I'd prepared in advance, I could paste something in here, and we'll do that in a minute because there's some cool tricks I want to show you on that. But there are also a bunch of tools available to you. For example, your paintbrush tool will allow you to now paint in perspective. As I draw this line, my brush will get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. As I get closer, it gets wider. And what it's doing is it's trying to use this box to determine perspective. So you can do paintings inside of here in perspective, which is pretty neat. You have a stamp tool, which gets a little complicated to the point that they explain it at the top. Alt-click in the plane you have, or in a plane. You can have multiple planes. I'll show you in a moment. Alt-click in a plane to set your source point for your clone. Once the source point is set, click and drag to paint or clone, shift click to end it. So alt click, and now you can see that I'm cloning, but I'm cloning in perspective. Again, it gets bigger as we get closer, and it gets smaller as we go over to the other edge. I'm just going to undo that with Control Z. Notice your Control Z key works fine. Lastly, and probably most importantly, you have the marquee tool. Now, normally, if you draw a square marquee, you get a square. But that's not the case in here. It's going to do it in perspective. So you can move this around till you've got it placed how you want. When you hold down Control, you'll notice you get this cool arrow. What it's saying is it's going to create a new copy, but it lets you do some editing first, and it lets you slide stuff around. So if you wanted, you could, whoop, let me deselect that, Control D to deselect. If you wanted to like drop down this conserve energy, you could hold down Control. Again, I'm still in the marquee tool. Hold down Control and just drag that down. Now, it's going to try to clone some stuff, so you might get some stuff you don't want. Not a problem. You get your stamp tool. You just select an area that doesn't have it, and Bob's your uncle. You've painted it away. Now, of course, you can also just tell it OK, and then paint that away with all of your tools, such as Content Aware, and be done with it pretty quickly. I'm just going to undo a few times, so that we get back to here, back when we've drawn the grid but haven't done anything with it. Now, I'm going to go ahead and do the marquee. I'm going to do something else. I'm going to Control and click. Notice that I'm still holding down Control. By clicking just once, it's separated this into a new piece. I'm actually going to release Control. I now have a copy of it. I can move wherever I want. Holding down Control again allows me to duplicate it. And so I could duplicate this again in perspective. Notice it gets bigger here, and there is distortion that's occurring because it's trying to upscale something. So be a little wary of that. And you could just keep like pasting stuff around. Again, I'm holding Control to make copies. If I don't want to hold a copy, that's fine. These are pasted down though, and then that's it. Now I can also zoom in. And if I want to zoom out, this is our zoom tool, Alt key, which lets you actually get some extra space in case you wanted to transform this beyond boundaries. You should still be able to. Let's see if that's the case. Early on in this, the only way to transform it, and again, I'm using the edit plane tool, only way to transform it was to use your crop tool to actually extend the length of it. It's not the case anymore. You can actually just drag stuff out. So you can have a huge plane. I'm just going to undo a few times. Depending on the version, you either need to Control Alt Z or Control Z. It will allow you to step back further in time. If you want to deselect, Control D will do exactly that. Okay, so you can do all these cool cloning techniques, but it gets even cooler. So let's say you had a building. Notice as I drag this edge, it's still in perspective because of how I built the plane. Let's say you had you wanted this stuff to like fly off somewhere. I'm going to go ahead and grab the marquee, sorry, not the marquee tool, the create plane tool. But this time, instead of just drawing a plane, I'm going to click on the previous plane. When I get this little white arrow when I do the edge. Now, this little dot right here, if I drag out on that dot, and older versions, you actually have to hold down Command on a Macintosh to do that. Notice I get this crazy thing happening. Now I'm going to hold down Control to get a third one. What's all this stuff? What's happening here? Well, I'm going to grab my marquee. I'm going to grab another copy of Smart by Control clicking. Now I've got this copy. Look at that. It's now drawing it through perspective across the box. Now again, I built that box carefully by grabbing the center point that appears by grabbing the Create Plane tool, clicking on and waiting till my mouse turns white like this, clicking on a plane. Then I get the center point. The first time you can just drag it out, but after that you have to hold down Control in order to re-access it. And you can build these complex objects. Now I can do stuff. Click. Oops. Oh, I grabbed the whole thing. Did not want to do that. Let's try that again. Marquee tool, Control D. I'm going to drag it, Control click to separate it. Now I can just move this around and it will transform throughout all the boxes, which is pretty cool. Now you can still edit these. If I get my edit plane tool, I can come in and edit them. But it gets tricky. It's going to try to keep these, you can scale them up and down without a problem. Now this works best, I think you have to, it works best when you only have two. Let me see if I can get it to work on the multiple ones. You're supposed to be able to, I guess not, Control click to edit the individual ones. But it appears that after it hits a limit, it starts to have a problem. No biggie, backspace. Here's what I was going to demonstrate. Let me just make another one real quick. Boop. Control click to drag it out. Now, I can get this. I could grab a corner. Notice it doesn't like some of these perspectives. I could grab a corner and I can adjust the perspective further. When it goes red, it hates it. It thinks that I'm doing bad perspective, which is pretty cool because I am actually doing bad perspective for this image, but it's fine for this demonstration. Marquee tool, drag, Control click to separate. And now notice it's broken them apart. So what do? Well, what you can do is actually do it in multiple parts by using copy and paste. So real quick though, let me hit OK, even though I have this insane mess. And the reason that I hit OK is that notice that the plane where I made all these edits, it still has it. It exists. So I can put it on my board where I edited stuff out. That's fine. Let me get rid of that. Now let's say we wanted to make some text and put this in perspective afterwards. Not a problem. Go ahead and make some text. Let's say you should buy this because it's a billboard, right? I'm just going to free transform with Control T. That will allow me to increase the size. There we go. All right. So yeah, it looks pretty good. Now I could try to just drag it around, but notice it's on a slant. I'd have to Control Alt and then maybe the transform would start to work, but maybe not what I want. So at that point, I'd probably do something like put it in a smart object. Once it's in a smart object, I can start to make up my own perspective and, you know, build it like that. Without the grid, it's a little tricky. So here's what you can do instead. Whoops, went too far. Let's resize that. Here's what you can do instead. I'm going to Control A, Control C, which will get the text. And oops, deselect. Now I'm going to make another layer because again, I don't want to do this filter on destructively. I want to do it as non-destructively as possible, even though it's a destructive filter. So I go to Filter, Vanishing Point. Notice it remembers your vanishing point, I believe, until you quit Photoshop. So I'm just going to backspace to delete that. And again, I like to do the vertical line first. And I'm just lining this up along edges that are in perspective naturally. Control V. All right, so I've pasted this text in, and now it's not text, it's rasterized. But it's just pasted. What's the deal? Drag it onto the plane, and voila. Once you're in there, you're able to move it around as though it's in perspective. which is pretty great. Now it gets more fun than that. Remember, you can get your create plane tool. I'm going to click on it when I have the white icon, and I'm just going to drag this out a little bit, just to have some fun. So, get my marquee tool back. Now notice the issue here. This is gone now. Once I've pasted it down, it's pretty much permanent. I can try to like clear it out, but really you'd be using the stamp. You're better off canceling and putting it in again. Now that said, I do have healing options, which I can try to put on, some feathering, all that good stuff. Same kind of tools that you have available in your normal stamp. What I'm just going to do for this demonstration is paste again. Oops, paste again. There we go. Bring it in and check this out. Look at that. Pretty cool, right? So that's essentially the vanishing filter, but there's one more neat trick here. Well, we didn't cover the ruler. The measure tool lets you try to figure out how big stuff is, which is pretty great. It's click 2 points to measure a distance, edit the distance to set the scale for measurement. So basically clicky, click. And then it tries to, oh, but I already have this, so it's going to freak out. It's essentially just trying to measure it. This video is dragging on. If you're interested in that, let me know and I'll talk about that. Let me tell it okay, just so we can take a look and check this out. It is all by itself, and we've got this cool bend. It's all set. Pretty neat. All right, so there's one more neat trick. Let me show you. Whoops, let me turn this back on. Again, a new blank layer. I'm going to go ahead and go into Filter. And I'm going to go to Vanishing Point. And again, delete won't do anything. You have to use backspace. All right, I'm going to create a new plane. Click, click. Click. And carefully click. All right, looks pretty good. Now, what I'm going to do is this. I am going to, well, I can render measurements to Photoshop, but I should be able to render the grid to Photoshop as well. And just a moment. Right, there's, I had to poke around for a minute there, so I needed to pause it. In order to render the grids to Photoshop, you have to take, you can't do it while you're in your Create Plane tool. Well, normally you can't do it while you're in the Create Plane tool. What you need to do is take the Edit Plane tool, click on it, and that should unlock it, and then you can render grids to Photoshop. So if I do that and tell it okay, I get this grid, and notice it's on the layer that I edited in. So what was the point to that? Here's the point. So we've got this text, right? That's just not in perspective at all. It just says you should buy this. If I encapsulate it in a smart object by right-clicking and converting to smart object, I can perform a transformation just as I did before. And holding down Control allows me to individually move the points here. But now I can line them up with this grid that Photoshop happily created for me, even though I'm doing these individually. And if I feel as though maybe that doesn't look super great, I could just transform that down. And again, I'll have to move all these points carefully lining them up with the grid that I created. Again, I'm just holding down Control, and I'm using standard Control T free transform. Here we go. So I've got you should buy this, right? But it's a smart object. I can turn off this grid now. I'm not using it. This is in perspective according to the grid that I created. It's a somewhat haphazardous grid. So if I come in here, double click the thumbnail, grab my text tool, I can edit this. And again, if you're falling off the screen, don't forget to go into the marquee tool and stretch that bad boy out, whatever direction you need to stretch it. Marquee tool, I'm sorry, the crop tool, stretch it out wherever you need to stretch it. Enter, Control S to update the PSB file, that is the smart object. Control W to close it. Look, we've got you should buy that. Now this is in perspective, but I can't move it around, but I have my grid. Again, not a super great grid. I should have lined it up better over here. So my perspective doesn't look very good. So let me walk you through that one more time from start to finish. Let's do this. So we have some text. Yeah. Now I want to be able to edit this later, but I want it to be transformed in perspective. So I zoom back out. I'm going to make a new layer because, again, the perspective filter is a destructive edit. I'm going to go to filter, and I'm going to go to vanishing point. This perspective filter, the vanishing point filter. So I don't like how this one looks. I'm going to backspace and it's gone. It's out of my life. I'm going to create the plane tool. I'm going to click, I'm going to follow a line a little bit. So I get the vertical line all right. I'm going to go all the way to the end this time so I can really get this in perspective. All right. Now I'm going to render out the grid. So I'm going to take the edit plane and click in the plane to make sure it's active. And for some reason, so on my version of Photoshop, it's a little tricky. I'm just going to click on this. You can make separate grids, by the way. I'm not trying to mention that. And these are independent of each other, or you can make them connected, and that's doable under here. Allow multi-surface operations, clip operations to surface edges so that it will not fly off. Backspace key. Anyway, so I'm going to click. Now I've got the grid, and it's doing it again. It just loves to stick on here. There we go. It should just do it. So this is a glitch in my version of Photoshop. It literally should be as easy as clicking the edit plane tool, clicking the plane, and then boom, render grids to Photoshop. But it's being a bit of a jerk. So what I'm going to do is this. I bet I can do this. No. I'm going to tell it okay, even though I didn't do anything. And now I'm going to come back to the filter. And since mine's glitching, you guys shouldn't have this kind of problem. It should literally just be vanishing point and get it up. And yeah, so in my case, I need to tell it okay, open it up a second time, it remembers where the grid is, then I can render the grid to Photoshop. Again, you shouldn't have to do that. It should just work the first time. I'm going to adjust my grid. I bet by adjusting the grid, it's not going to let me do it. Is there any rhyme or reason? No, it will let me do it now. So in my glitched version, I have to tell it okay, even though I don't do any changes, go back to the vanishing point filter, and then it will allow me to render grid to Photoshop. All right, so live and learn. Hopefully you won't have to do that. I've got my beautiful little grid. I've got my text. I'm going to right click on the text layer. I'm going to convert it to a smart object. And now that it's a smart object, I can do a Control T, a standard transformation, and I can hold down the Control key, and I can line up these points with the grid that I created. And now that I've done that, making sure that not only the horizontal lines, but also the vertical lines, now it's in perspective. But unlike with the vanishing point, because it's a smart object, I can double click it. And now I can grab my text tool. I could do like buddy. And again, if it flies off, not a problem. Grab my crop tool and just expand it. Enter. Control S to save. File save would work as well. Close the tab. Hey, buddy. And it should still be in perspective. We can double check if it's not. Control T. We've still got our grid. Looks pretty close, but actually we can see it got a little bit off when it increased in size. Not a problem. I kept my grid. Because I kept my grid, I can do my adjustments. There we go. Enter. And there we have it. It's in perspective, but it's editable because I've got a little grid that I kept for myself. Keep in mind that that grid was on a new layer. Wow, you can't see that at all. The grid was on a new layer, so it exists by itself. The only caveat is in my glitchy version of Photoshop, I had to, follow along with me, do a filter vanishing point. Actually, let's start from scratch. Tell it okay. Do a filter vanishing point. So we've got no vanishing point. Create my grid, plane, click, 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 click. When I go to render, Oh, this time it has it. So if it doesn't have it, I would just, after making the grid, tell it okay, even though I didn't do anything. Go to Filter, Vanishing Point. It will load up the previous grid since I haven't closed Photoshop. Click on it. Render grid to Photoshop. It's a little drop-down menu right there. Tell it okay. And I've got a grid. And with that grid, I can do transformations and follow it along in order to put things in perspective. Because it's a smart object, I can edit it, and then I can just double check my work. And if I make this the correct size, and one caveat there, check this out. So on this particular text from an earlier setting, here we go. From an earlier setting, the text was expanding out from the center. Notice there it was set to center text. I'm going to left align it. Okay, make sure that it's still in perspective. Control T. Looks good. All right. So now if I edit it, since it'll be not moving left and right, I can do hey friend, save, close the tab. It should, Control T. Yep, remain in perspective. There we go. Because it was going from the center, it was changing how the perspective was going to be. Also, by changing the... Well, that's not entirely true. It fiddles with it a little bit. It's better if you go in one... You know what? I'm wrong on that. I'm completely wrong. I don't know what I'm thinking. It's because I had done the crop tool and increased the size. It was no longer in perspective. I don't know what I was thinking there. Sorry about that. So anyway, I guess 25-minute long videos, my brain starts to fry out. Anyway, I've kept the grid though, so I can do these transformations. It doesn't matter if you edit from the center or the left or the right. The only difference is if you do the crop tool and change the size of it, it will no longer be in perspective until you do a free transformation again. Anyway, that's how I prefer to use the vanishing point filter. Just make a grid. Again, this version of Photoshop is a little glitchy, so you have to fiddle around with it. Your version should hopefully be fine, and if not, you know how to handle that. That's the vanishing point. Super useful tool. Let me know if you have any questions.